In the afternoon we reached the Villia crossing. There were many vehicles and men crowded together on the bank, waiting their turn to pass through the eye of a needle, which was the crossing. It was several barges tied together by cables. They stood across the river and acted as bridge abutments. Bridges were thrown between the barges. A little lower down there was a ferry, and boats were running back and forth. Everywhere on the banks of the river there was mangled equipment. The green carpet of the meadow was cut by tracks and wheels. There were oil and fuel oil puddles, smoking craters and brown earth thrown out of them. The Germans had recently bombed the crossing. The orderlies were carrying stretchers, picking up the dead and wounded. They were assisted by the soldiers, who gathered in separate groups by units and subdivisions, waiting for the command to cross to the other side. The sappers were digging on the bridge, patching and restoring what the enemy aviation had broken. Major Bereskin reported to the young colonel about the arrival of the battalion. The colonel, apparently the most senior of the commanders here, somehow indifferently accepted the report. He already had a lot of troops to ferry, and new units were arriving here. Our commander took his unit to the edge of the forest and announced that here you can settle down for a rest and wait for the command to cross. He left Lieutenant Vesenin in charge and went to fulfill some assignment of the colonel. We realized that the battalion had ceased to exist. I, with my friends Yelkin and Yushakov, settled down in the shade of a large pine tree. We took off our boots, untied our bags, and started our meagre lunch. At that time, the crossing started to work. We watched as a young colonel, accompanied by commanders with red armbands on their sleeves, went around and checked the bridge, and then they spread out in a chain. The colonel gave a command in a loud voice that the wagons with the wounded should be the first to cross to the other side. Vesenin went somewhere and, returning, began to talk to the soldiers. We have no chance to get to the other side today, and the Germans are constantly bombing the crossing. I suggest to all who can swim to get to the other side by themselves. The river is fast and wide. I'll give you an hour to rest and search for auxiliary means. We'll carry the machine guns on a raft. Those who cannot swim, wait in line. You will be transported by boat, said Vesenin. What he said next, we did not manage to hear. A lieutenant with a red armband came up and, paying attention to me, Ushakov and Elkin, rudely said, "Hey, you, why are you falling apart like at a resort? Pack your stuff and get on the raft. Change the guys because they haven't let the poles out of their hands for half a day." The lieutenant pointed to the place where the tractor was being driven onto the raft. We quickly tied the sacks, pulled on boots, and went to change the fighters from the ferry. The tractor driven onto the ferry was the most extreme load for this watercraft, so we pushed off with great care with poles, trying to make the raft sway less. Otherwise the machine with its weight could tilt the raft and slip off it. The middle of the river was behind us when suddenly the command was heard. Air. The German vultures dropped their bombs above us, on the barges. The river boiled. The bombs fell on the clusters of people and equipment on the shore. Their everything stirred up like an anthill. The airplanes on a shaving flight mercilessly poured lead on the coast. The wave from the bomb burst tilted the raft by 30 degrees. Sliding off it, the tractor crawled to my side. I jumped forward, and at that time something hit me on the arm. As I surfaced, I saw the raft being carried downstream, and it was spinning like a ewer. There was no tractor or people left on the raft. Overcoming the pain in my arm, I barely swam to the shore and immediately fell face first into the sand. "Sarge, are you alive?" Someone shook me by the shoulder. I stood up and opened my eyes. It was Yushakov. Next to him stood Elkin. "I saw a board hit you. I thought it was the end. Something hit me in the head, too. My ears are still ringing and I can't hear very well. But the tractor driver, it seems, was killed," Yushakov mumbled in a high-pitched voice. It turned out that only Yelkin got off easy from the bombing. As soon as the raft tilted, he dived and swam underwater and surfaced in the direction of the shore. He swam out above us and found Ushakov, who was sitting on the shore and shaking the water out of his ears, as boys do after bathing. Exhausted and wrinkled, we reached the grove. It was cut by a road going eastward. After walking about 2 kilometers, we came to the edge of the forest, behind which the fields spread out, away from the crossing, which was continuously bombed. The fighters who had escaped from the other side of Velija were resting. Of course, it was possible to go farther away, but not everyone had the strength for it. Positioned under the bushes, we dozed off. We were terribly hungry, but our bags with provisions, overcoats, weapons were swept off the raft by a wave. Fortunately, a group of fighters stationed nearby, having learned from Elkin about our misfortune, shared their food supplies with us. We were refreshed and felt more alert. On the road to the east, there was a continuous stream of unorganized groups of fighters and whole units with equipment. There were also wagons with the household goods of refugees. Many of them walked on foot with knots, shoulder bags and suitcases. Children were with them. Their faces were dirty, tired and frightened. Apparently, others from other crossings were coming to this road. People were coming towards them. They, having lost hope, were returning to the place from which they had fled, thinking, whatever will be. We prepared to go eastward, but suddenly it was no longer a command, but just a warning, rather panicky shout. Air, air, rolled through the column and repeated in the grove. Airplanes flew over the column, shooting people from machine guns. Next they covered the road with bombs and then began to bomb the grove. There was nowhere to run, and we, with our faces and the ground, burrowed into it. Huge pine trees were cracking, falling from bomb bursts. We were showered with splinters from the trees by bullets. Nearby we could hear the moaning of the wounded, but somehow we were not hit. From the grove the Germans transferred their bombing strikes to the crossing. Near us, where a group of fighters was stationed, a bomb exploded during the raid. One of the soldiers was killed. Petya, don't die. Please, darling, it's not a mortal wound. You'll live. You'll live, wailed the junior sergeant, holding the corpse of the soldier in his arms. The commander's eyes were filled with horror and tears. Why is he killing himself so much? Yushakov asked a soldier standing next to him. You will be killed because it's his own brother. They are twins, the fighter explained in passing. Units that suffered from the bombing began to collect the dead, wounded and weapons. Hastily bandaged, the wounded were sent eastward on wagons in the hope that some medical centre would be found where they could receive serious help. The dead were gathered together in one place and began to dig a mass grave at the edge of the forest. The lieutenant, who knew about our misfortunes, showed us a pile of weapons and ammunition collected from the dead. Choose what you want. You can take overcoats and duffel bags. Who knows, by the time you find your unit, you may have to fight, he said. We took everything we needed. Ushakov chose a hand machine gun and took 3 discs. After thinking about it, he took the 4th one and gave it to Elkin to carry. Elkin and I each took a machine gun and a couple of loaded discs. We also found grenades for us. Having fully equipped ourselves, we started on the road, but in the rye we heard a child crying. We approached, and tears rolled down everyone's eyes. A woman was lying on the ground with her arms spread apart, and a girl of about 2 or 3 years old was crawling and crying near her. She was shaking her mother, hoping to wake her up. Yushakov forcibly tore her away from her mother. The girl fought back, looking back, and Ushakov went to the road from this terrible place. Our attempts to calm the child and talk to him did not give any result. At last we succeeded in getting the girl to give her name. Her name was Nadia. At that time a wagon was returning. On it sat an old man and an old woman who had lost all hope of escaping from danger. Where are we going, old man? Yushakov asked the grandfather. I see to our village. It seems that we are not destined to escape from the Germans. As if waving away flies, the old man replied unhappily. What village? What is your surname, first name, and patronymic? Yushakov pressed on. The grandfather became wary and blinked his eyes fearfully. He named his village, first name, patronymic, and surname, and then he looked fearfully and questioningly at Yushakov. The latter, having lowered the girl from his arms to the ground, rummaged in his trouser pocket, took out a lump of wet paper and a pencil, and pretended to write it down. Well, let's check it out, said Yushakov. By God, I've not lied, comrade soldier. The village is not far away. 3 versts, no more, and convince the old man? So, grandfather, take this girl for upbringing. The Germans killed her mother. When we come back, we'll check it out. I have your address and surname here. Yushakov patted the pocket where he put the paper. The old woman, who had been silent until then, wailed that they had nothing to eat. Where would they go with the girl? But the grandfather said, squinting at Yushakov, that it was all right. The 3 of them would somehow manage to survive the winter, for the war would not last. Having handed the girl over to the old men, we set off. The sun was setting, and the stifling heat began to subside. The road we followed led to the highway. There a large mixed column of our troops stopped for a short halt. Since we were tired, we decided to have a rest too. In order not to get lost in the foreign units, we settled down on a small hill. Just sat down, as suddenly Yelkin jumped up and pointed at the approaching cloud of dust with his hand. We jumped up and saw that an old general was galloping along the column on a snow-white horse like a swan. He was without a cap, and with one hand he periodically smoothed his grey beard on his head. I had seen such a beautiful horse, on which the general sat only in movies and pictures, and the general sat in the saddle as if he were taking a parade, riding up to the lawn near which stood 4 tanks. The general jumped off the horse, kissed him on the forehead, took off the expensive bridle and gently clapped his palm on his thigh. This theatrical spectacle did not fit the situation. It was more like a cheap farce. The general quickly pulled on the overalls given by the lieutenant and disappeared into the hatch of the lead tank. The engines roared, leaving behind them a cloud of dust. Tanks on the side of the road rushed forward, overtaking the column. The horse coolly took the farewell to his master. He was calmly nibbling on the succulent grass on the lawn, paying no attention to anyone. We silently watched this scene with bated breath. Yelkin brought us out of the state of calm. He stood on a stump and, making an artistic gesture, began to recite. As now the prophetic Oleg is going to avenge the unwise Khazars. Shut up, pariah, or someone will snitch in the special department that you mock the general. Then, oh, you'll be in a lot of trouble. Yelkin was stopped by a thin and as tall as him fighter. Yelkin hastily jumped down from the stump. After walking with the column for a couple of hours, we decided to spend the night. Fatigue was killing us, and there was nothing ahead but the unknown. We settled down in a thicket away from the road. We did not set up a watch, as we were sure that nobody would come there at night. Here, I thought, what inconveniences we would have experienced if the soldiers had not provided us with overcoats of our dead comrades at the crossing. We did not eat dinner because we were so tired. I woke up at dawn hearing bird voices. The sun had not yet peeked into our thicket. Only by the tops of the trees I could realize that it had already risen and maybe half peeked out from behind the horizon. Elkin and Yushakov were already awake and were waiting for me to wake up. We had a quick snack and headed for the road. On the way we washed our faces in a big clean puddle. There was no column with which we were walking yesterday. The road became worse. It was harder to walk after the rest, as my legs were swollen. There was a silence unaccustomed for us. No one came across us. And since we were not moving too fast, we were overtaken and passed by separate groups of fighters who called themselves platoons, companies, battalions. We tried to find out from them how things were going at our crossing, and whether the Germans were far away. But we could not hear anything definite. These people were crossing the Vilia River in other places. Sometime around noon we were overtaken by 2 fighters. One of them I recognized. I had seen him in Lieutenant Vesenin's company. When asked if he was from there, the fighter answered in the affirmative. There, behind 300 or 400 meters away, Vesenin is going with the company, and we are the head patrol, said the fighter. We decided to wait for the commander and go with the company. There were only 12 men left of the unit, which had about 100 men at the crossing. Vesenin himself was gaunt and solidly grey. Vesenin's company was almost halved after the Nazi air raid. Then he decided to immediately overcome the river by swimming. When people were already in the water, the next raid began. Those who swam badly and fell under the bullets of the stormtroopers drowned. With our replenishment in the company became 15 people. They told me that there's something wrong with the lieutenant. He's always blaming himself for the loss of life. And at night he hardly slept. The machinery that had passed along the road before us had loosened the sandy soil, and my boots got stuck. We had to walk on the side of the road. Lieutenant Vesenin went ahead of the company, not losing sight of the head patrol of 2 fighters. The forest began to thin, and ahead they saw a gap. The men of the head watch, having reached the edge of the forest, stopped and, turning to the right, talked about something. Vesenin gestured for the company to lie down. After waiting a minute, he went to the head sentry to find out what was the matter and told us to wait. Having talked to the men from the watch, the lieutenant let the company go on. When we reached the edge of the forest, we saw a terrible picture. To our right, the burned village was smouldering and smouldering. Where there were houses, stoves, and chimneys, burnt tattle were lying. What is it? No matter how carefully we looked, we could not see any signs of fighting. There was no doubt that the German pilots had simply burned the settlement with incendiary bombs. On the road we counted 6 such villages. I and other fighters were heartbroken by such cruelty. There is a war going on, but what about the peaceful people who were deprived of shelter and everything they had? Why burn, destroy, and shoot peaceful refugees who had done nothing wrong to anyone? But we're just trying to get away from the places where the war was going on. I understood one thing, that it would not go in vain without avenging the enemy. My comrades silently looked at these horrible pictures, and in each of them anger was boiling. Anger towards the enemy grew and matured. Aye. At that time I did not understand the cruelty of the fascists, and only afterwards I learned that all this was a systematic policy of Hitler's top brass, aimed at exterminating most of the Soviet people, enslaving the rest, and expanding the living space of the Great Reich. I remembered the beastly grin of the pilot who was shaving the machine gun and pouring lead from the machine gun on the wagons of refugees. Don't they realize that all this could turn against themselves, that the time will come and they will be paid for everything in full? I thought. Yes, and so it happened. The bet on cruelty turned against the Germans. Those who saw or experienced the atrocities could not be indifferent to the enemy. Even those who at first did not intend to fight the enemy went to the partisans, replenishing the formations of people's avengers. Yes, this is how a truly popular holy war matured. And then we cautiously and timidly made our way to the front line to join our own. The forest began to thin again. The road led to a meadow 1.5 kilometers away from which the village began on a hillock. In the middle of the meadow there was a hillock overgrown with bushes. A petty officer came out from behind the hillock and gestured to us to stop. "Where are you coming from and what unit?" he asked Vesenin. He answered that we were coming from different parts of the 84th Division from the Vilia crossing. The petty officer did not ask anything more, and said that the lieutenant led his platoon to the headquarters and reported on the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Gurov. He himself went off again behind the hillock. As we passed by, we saw that he twisted the handle of the telephone and began to talk to someone. Next to the petty officer lay 2 fighters behind a machine gun. The headquarters was located in the center of the village, in a 2-story house above which hung a sign village council. A stocky, rather grey-haired lieutenant colonel came out to meet us. Vesenin reported our arrival. "How's the company?" I was reported that the platoon asked Lieutenant Colonel Vesenin. "This is all that's left of the company," answered Vesenin. "There's not even a platoon here." The lieutenant colonel shook his head disappointedly. After a moment's silence, he said thoughtfully, as if to himself, "Yes, and we do not have too much. There was a regiment, and now we don't know how to make a battalion." A company was created from suitable groups of fighters. Its task was to provide cover for the battalion. Lieutenant Colonel set a goal to gather the scattered units of different parts and go to break through to their own across the front line. Since the reconnaissance reported that in a couple of hours to the village should approach the German column, he decided to cover forces to give it a fight. Lieutenant Colonel ordered to build a battalion. He announced to the men that from the fragmentary information received by radio, the picture is as follows. Our troops are holding the defense along the eastern bank of the western divide. There is no solid front line. We will look for free passages or weak points in the location of the Germans. If we can't find any, we'll have to fight, said the lieutenant colonel. On the streets of the village was not seen a single civilian. Suddenly the inhabitants began to appear. They hurried to the village council. There a young guy was fixing a loudspeaker on a... Now an important message will be transmitted. Commanders, place your units closer to the pole so that everyone can hear. Said the lieutenant colonel. After 2 or 3 minutes the microphone boomed, wheezed, and then heard the words. My comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters, fighters of our army and navy, I am addressing you, my friends. This is Stalin speaking. Stalin passed a whisper through the crowd, and then there was silence. Everyone tried to catch every word. Stalin spoke slowly, deftly, with a Caucasian accent. It was the first time I heard his voice. When he began to talk about the partisan movement, the command was heard. Battalion, alarm! The commanders took the units to the western slope of the hill on which the village was located. The assembled company four-stepped to pass 1.5 kilometers to the northwest and ride the road on which the enemy column was moving. Entrench and entrench, camouflage and wait for the enemy, path of the column to miss. It must be destroyed by units that have prepared defences at the foot of the hill. The enemy is expected in an hour. In the assembled company, I was appointed squad leader in the 2nd platoon. Our frontier was a shallow ravine no more than 1.5 meters deep. It was apparently created by the spring flood, so we didn't have to dig much. But it was more difficult to camouflage, because on this side of the road there were no bushes or tall grass. The German column consisted of a battalion, which was located on vehicles. It was evidently some kind of auxiliary rear unit, hurrying after the main force which had gone far away. In front, about 50 meters away, rode 3 motorcyclists. The column was closed by 2 field kitchens, a staff, van, and a passenger car. The Germans, knowing that the forward units had advanced far ahead, behaved rather carelessly. Of this I was convinced by the fact that even with a little alertness they could have detected us. When a green flare went up, we opened fire. It was so unexpected for the enemy that the Germans, jumping out of the car, ran in different directions, not listening to what the officers shouted to them. Several Germans ran straight at the machine gun. They felt the danger only when half of them were killed. A passenger car and a van did not get away in time. This fight lasted no more than 40 minutes. I don't know if many of the enemy managed to escape. The battlefield was strewn with corpses. A red flare announced the withdrawal. We suffered almost no casualties. Lieutenant Colonel, having lined up the battalion to the column, led it 5 kilometers by road, then the forest in a southwestern direction. We went at a forced pace, because, according to intelligence, behind this German column in half an hour should come another. A dozen kilometers later we came to a greater road, on both sides of which ran a rather deep and viscous swamp. There was a dead, oppressive silence all around. The sun warmed mercilessly, there was not the slightest movement in the hot air, and the leaves on the trees did not even move. A bath, that's all. The front seemed to be far away. But after a couple of hours we heard the rumble of explosions, and then the rumble of German airplane engines. They were coming from the east, so there's a battle going on somewhere not far away. Strangely enough, this pleased us. There was a chance to meet our own soon. The battalion stopped for a rest in the woods. The units deepened from the road for 100 meters, setting up sentries on the side of the road. A messenger from the battalion commander, hastily looking for Lieutenant Vezinin, told him to come to the lieutenant colonel urgently. Half an hour later, the company commander returned. He, having gathered the commanders of platoons and departments, said that the lieutenant colonel had a council to discuss how to proceed. Many commanders, especially the battalion chief of staff Litsky, insisted on breaking into small groups and make their way to the front line. Lieutenant Colonel was of a different opinion. Small groups the Germans will easily kill and capture, and the battalion is still a force. If it enters the battle, it will do some damage to the enemy. Lieutenant Colonel insisted on his own. Option staffers were taken only in the extreme case, when the battalion will create a desperate situation. After hearing Lieutenant Vesenin's report, the commanders dispersed to their units. I lay down under a sprawling fir tree, laying under myself on the grass, which grew here up to my waist. I fell asleep instantly, guessing the evening when the heat began to subside, as if in a dream I heard, "Company, get up," and then I fell asleep again. Someone kicked me on the legs with a boot. Then I jumped up, not realizing what was the matter. Ushakov was standing next to me. "Why are you so sleepy?" "The battalion is about to start," he said. "Hey, how much I would have given for lying down for a couple more hours." My legs and shoulders were swollen and weak. I had to warm up. There was a command. "Go to the road to form up." The soldiers walked leisurely, staggered to the road, and somehow lazily got into formation. Many of them were half asleep. The column moved. "Now, if we had a good formation, all the sleep would disperse," said Ushakov. "But in our position, singing is impossible. We must do everything so that the enemy did not find the battalion. We had no time to pass 3 kilometers as the battalion stopped. We again from the road deepened into the forest. Returning from the battalion commander, Lieutenant Vesenin said that while we were resting, a group of scouts found out what was ahead of us. After 7 kilometers along the road is a large village, and in the neighborhood of it scattered several farms. In the village up to a company of the enemy. Germans put up around the village barricades with machine guns, it seems, very afraid of the units coming out of the encirclement. Combat decided to defeat the enemy. From each company was ordered to allocate a squad to stealthily approach the barriers and silently eliminate them. If this fails, at the same time with all forces to attack the enemy, destroy it and continue to move along the road. The destruction of the barrier on the north side of the village was assigned to my squad. Those who were to eliminate the barriers went forward. 20 minutes later, the whole battalion moved forward. About 7 kilometers later, the group for the elimination of obstacles came to the edge of the forest. We began to assess ways of approach to machine gun points. The Germans had arranged them in such a way that it was very difficult to approach stealthily. From the edge of the forest to the point for 200 meters stretched a meadow with low grass. To clarify the position of the machine gun point on the north side of the village, our squad had to make a considerable detour through the forest. The machine gun point, which we were to destroy, was located on a hillock where there was a chapel or some monument. From the rear to the machine gun point almost closely approached vegetable gardens. "What are we going to do?" I asked Sergeant Dremin. "The hell he knows. They are neither straight, nor to the right nor to the left cannot be removed. If only from the rear, from the vegetable gardens," he somehow indifferently answered. "Perhaps that's the only reasonable solution," I confirmed. "But how to get into the village, into the vegetable gardens?" To the right, a kilometer from the point, there was a hollow. Apparently, it used to be a ditch, but now it is overgrown with grass. 2 soldiers would crawl along this ditch to the vegetable gardens, and there along the furrows to the machine gun and destroy the fascists with grenades. It was not possible to finish the point silently. The Germans here, in comparison with those who were at the exit of the road to the village, behaved carelessly. They, seated in a circle, were engaged in something, either playing cards or discussing something. They stood up to their full height. Apparently, none of them was expecting danger from this side, because the 300 meters clear strip separating them from the forest reliably guaranteed them from any surprises. We lay down in the bushes and watched the ditch intensely, but we could not discover how Dremin and his 2 men were making their way to the vegetable gardens. The right side did not interest the Germans. One of them, apparently a non-commissioned officer, in binoculars carefully and for a long time looked in our direction. We froze, pressing all our bodies into the ground. but he did not see anything suspicious, came to a group of playing cards and sat down next to us. And so the non-commissioned officer periodically, after 10 minutes, with binoculars surveyed the terrain ahead and sat down in a circle again. After 30 minutes, we noticed how, ducking down, quickly someone jumped out of the ditch and disappeared into the vegetable garden, followed by another and a third. We breathed a sigh of relief and transferred all our attention to the group of Germans at the machine gun. Some time passed, and the non-commissioner again took up surveillance. We began to worry. Why Dremin does not act because it takes no more than 3 minutes to overcome the distance to throw a grenade, and it has been at least. But here the Germans became alarmed, and one after another 4 explosions were heard. The non-commissioner staggered, dropped his binoculars, and fell down. The bewildered Germans were also hit by grenade splinters. At that time a loud hurrah came from the side of the road, and machine gun bursts merged in a general rumble. We realized that the battalion was attacking the village. At the same time, we saw that from behind the barns of the outermost houses, 5 armoured personnel carriers drove towards the attackers. Soldiers ran out of the houses, formed up and rushed in the direction where the battle was going on. We, having jumped out of our hiding place, ran to the place where Dremin and his men had dealt with the German post. The group from the hillock looked in the direction where the battle was unfolding. When Dremin saw us, he waved his hands for us to run back, and all 3 of us rushed in our direction. "What is it?" I asked when I got close to Dremin. Intelligence failed. In the village is not a company, there are 2 battalions, no less, and a lot of armoured personnel carriers. The battalion is finished, we have to get away before it's too late, Dremin said, faltering and panting. And then we saw panic-stricken fighters fleeing. About a dozen armoured personnel carriers were crushing them and cutting them with machine guns. We rushed into the forest and ran for a long time in a northeastern direction. We slowed down the pace when only rare shots were heard from the battlefield. After 2 hours exhausted to the limit, we decided to rest in a thick thicket of hazel trees. We listened to the dead silence around. We untied our bags and realized that the food would be enough for 3 days, not more. Many of us had already run out of Makorka. We had 4 discs left for a hand machine gun, 3 discs each for machine guns, and 30 to 40 cartridges each for a rifle and a carbine. I still had my compass. We checked it. It was in good working order. We had a frugal snack and decided to sleep. We posted a sentry. I gave him a watch to wake up the next soldier in 2 hours. Sergeant Dremin took me aside and told me to put 2 men on watch. To my question why, he said he would explain later. "I'd better take care of the organization of security myself," said Dremin, and put 2 fighters on guard duty. One should guard on one side, the other on the opposite side. We settled in the middle. I woke up, or rather they woke me up at 6 in the morning. I got up with difficulty. The duty officer handed me the watch. They woke up Dremin too. Both men, who had passed the watch, fell asleep instantly. I wanted to take the place where the soldier who handed me the post was on duty, but Dremin stopped. "Here we sit here. Everything can be seen from here," he said, pointing to a hillock with bushes. "And why did you put the sentries separately?" I asked. "God takes care of him," as if reluctantly stretched out Dremin. He said that at one of the breaks in their company sentry or defected to the enemy or just ran away. It was good that the Germans were not around. When people don't know each other and they can't exchange words with each other, and someone from the campers can hear, they won't agree. And it's also difficult to sneak away unnoticed. We do not know each other. Caution is always necessary. I trust you, Dremin looked at me with the same lazy indifference. I've already made sure that this seemingly inconspicuous sergeant wisely looks at everything. I shared with Dremin Makorka, and we smoked self-curls. Yes, I wonder if Lieutenant Colonel Gurov is alive. I have no doubt that only half of the battalion survived. And he was a good commander, as if talking to himself Dremin reasoned. If he was a good commander, the battalion would not have fallen into a trap. We should have listened to the staff. I objected. Garov has nothing to do with it. He failed intelligence. She negligently approached the case. When we broke into the vegetable garden, I saw behind the barns 5 armoured personnel carriers and many cars. You don't get that much equipment in one company. How many of them are hidden there? I wanted to crawl back to tell my men, but I realized I wouldn't have time anyway, and then the shooting started by the roadside. No, I think I'd better do one task. That's why I stayed longer in the vegetable garden, said Dremin. Now the Germans are probably combing the forest there, I said. I don't think so. In the forest on an armoured personnel carrier cannot pass, and the Germans will not go far from the cars, said the sergeant. He talked for a long time about what war is. We are just learning to fight, and the German is only learning. Russia is not Western Europe. The dimensions are different here. The enemy has an advantage in equipment. If the battalion had at least 2 tanks, things would have taken a different turn. I wondered who Dremin was before his service. He didn't answer the question right away. Do you think? He asked me a counter-question. I shrugged my shoulders. He was silent for a moment and looked at me carefully. Sir, you can't guess right away. I was an accountant. There was a big shortage in our village store. I knew who was stealing, but I kept quiet. I was afraid of the bosses, and they said, "We don't know anything." The accountant must have been doing some sort of cheating, but I, in good conscience, had never concealed a penny of state money in my entire life. The chairman of the district store warned me, "If you say, we'll cut you off. And if you keep quiet, you'll take the blame, and we'll help you get out of jail quickly." But the investigator was smart. He dug into everything and said I must have been intimidated. So I told him the whole truth. I was released and the thieves were convicted. They did about 10 years in jail each. I was soon drafted into the army. Ever since then, I've had no tolerance for cowards. I realized that cowardice can make a man do all sorts of stupid things and then repent. But it's too late. And now I'm sure many are deserting or going to the Germans with favours. But you'll have to answer for it if you've broken your oath. The same sentry who ran away from the company we found on one farm when the German post was destroyed there. He, our sentry, was under lock and key, tied up and beaten. He says that the Germans tortured him, but they couldn't get anything good out of him. He didn't know German, and they didn't know Russian. The commander did not hesitate long and shot the scoundrel, and so he would still live. Maybe he would grieve here with us. Or maybe he would have lived to see the victory and returned home a hero. I listened to Dremin and thought how much experience he had, how many good thoughts in his head. Only this man does not open up to everyone, and if he does, then his whole soul comes out. It put a lot of good things into me during those 2 hours. We walked eastward, checking our route with a compass. But even without a compass we could keep the direction, for the days were sunny, and it was not difficult to determine where south, north and east were. Our food supplies came to an end. By the evening of an unknown date, because we had lost count of the days, we shook out the last crumbs from our bags. Then we made a rush of 12 kilometres along the roadsides and spent the night in the forest. Somewhere from the east we could hear the barking of dogs and the singing of roosters. We, hungry and exhausted, decided to break our overnight stay, to get closer to the village or hamlet from where the barking was coming and try to get some food there. Neglecting caution, they walked straight along the road. After half an hour's walking, the forest seemed to break off. Ahead, both to the right and to the left, were fields. In the east, on the horizon, a white streak appeared, heralding the dawn. After another half a kilometre, we saw a hedge. We lay down at the edge of the field and watched what lay ahead. It was getting brighter. We could distinguish a swampy lowland in front of us. To the left, the road we had come on, a wooden bridge over a dried-up brook. On the other side of the lowland there was a bush, and beyond it the road went uphill. Away from the road stood an old but still good house with a barn and vegetable gardens, sloping down the slope to a gully that skirted the buildings and was lost behind them. We watched for about 10 minutes. The rooster crowed again. which made us wince with surprise. The door creaked, and a young woman came out on the porch with a milking can and disappeared behind the barn. After watching for another half an hour, we consulted on what to do. Dremin said that this must be the outskirts of the village, which must be farther away, beyond the hills. He suggested that I should go into the house and the others stay here and cover in case of trouble. I entered the courtyard. A shaggy dog rushed towards me with a bark. Fortunately, he was on a short chain. The owner, jumping out of the house, tested the dog, and he, lowering his tail, went guiltily into the kennel. I said that I was not alone. There were comrades behind the gully, waiting for the signal. She agreed to take everyone in. I, going out on the porch, let it be known that the fighters were coming here. The woman invited everyone to the table, got 2 loaves of bread from somewhere, went down to the cellar, and bought 2 crinkles of milk. We greedily pounced on the food. The woman tried to start a conversation, but when she saw how greedily we ate, she waited until we were full. She began to ask who we were, where we were from, and what we intended to do next. I told her that there was a wounded man among us who needed bandaging. She asked one of the 2 teenagers about 11 years old, who were curiously examining our weapons, to run to Aunt Natasha and tell her that she was urgently expected. "This is our nurse. She'll be here in half an hour," the woman reassured us. Natasha came, a cheerful girl of about 18 or 19. She examined the wound of the soldier, who had been wounded in the left arm by a bullet. She treated the wound and deftly bandaged it. She said that the wound was not dangerous and would heal before the wedding. The hostess watched us for a long time and warily, and then decided to open up. "Guys, who among you wants to go to the partisans?" She asked directly. "We need experienced fighters to help teach us how to wield weapons and fight." We refused her offer, reasoning that our duty is to get out of the encirclement and beat the fascists in the ranks of the Red Army. The woman told us that in their village the Germans had not yet been, but in the neighboring villages they had already visited and were beginning to brutalize. Recently, rear garrisons have begun mass searches for units of Red Army soldiers who have fallen into the encirclement. This includes units that are moving to the front. In their village there appeared one who is looking out for everyone, but the remaining men threatened him. "If anything happens to anyone, we'll kill you first." It's like he's been cutting back on his activity. "Why are you talking to us so frankly? Maybe we were sent by the Germans or sold out to them," Dremin asked the woman. "I was initially wary when I saw that you have, in addition to ours and German machine guns. But then I realized that you are honest Soviet people," she replied, embarrassed. Then Dremin pointed out to her the lapses in conspiracy. "Oh, Maria Ivanovna, you need to remove the remnants of manicure from your nails. Who believe you're a country girl. You should change your gait too. Here is a nurse, that for the intelligentsia of the village will pass. But you are still many not country, and your hands are urban." I immediately noticed it. "Ywe," says Dremin. "Thank you. I'll take it all into account." There was no time to prepare. Today, the decision of the district committee, and tomorrow to get down to business, when they're all to think through, justified the mistress. It turned out that this house was chosen to meet the encircled people and recruit them to the partisan detachment, and to show the safe way to those who were going to the front. From the women we learned the most reliable and shortest route to our own. They gave us a loaf of the road, and one of the teenagers led us to the right road. We were curious about the organization of the partisan detachment, whether there were many people in it, how they were armed, but we did not get anything from the teenager who accompanied us for about an hour. We wandered around the rear for a long time. Our clothes were in shreds, the loaf of bread had long ago been eaten to a crumb. The roads we took and watched were deserted. In short, we were close to despair and total physical exhaustion. What to do next? This question constantly tormented each of us. I no longer felt like a commander, and my comrades as subordinates. We acted, one could say, by inertia. On the 3rd or 4th day, having consulted, we decided to follow the road to the ease. What will be, will be. We could fight and die, or maybe we would be lucky. And no sooner had we passed 3 kilometers than a dozen horsemen came out from behind a bend to meet us. We had no time to prepare for battle, but they surrounded us. It turned out to be our reconnaissance. Its commander, looking at our pitiful appearance, what a bunch of warriors. He asked with bitter sympathy who we were, where we were from, and where we were going. We gave a brief account of our misfortunes. One could guess that it was not the first time that the cavalrymen met with such wanderers as us. That's right. You can't tell where the hell you're coming from. That wheel you gave me goes through both German and our rear. Now take this road. They're 5 kilometers from here. Contact the commandant of the garrison. He will decide what to do with you, summarize the conversation. The commander of the cavalry and the group of scouts rode on. We came to a small station. On the platform sat and lay in groups of soldiers. The square in front of the station was also crowded with units that had settled down to rest. Our appearance attracted everyone's attention. Thinness and dirt on our faces. Tattered uniforms distinguished our unit from other units. "Where are you from, boys?" they asked us. "We were sneaking out of the encirclement," we answered. The soldiers shook their heads and gave us sympathetic looks. Tired and hungry, we settled down under an acacia bush. "What are we going to do?" I asked the fighters. "Shall we report our arrival to the local authorities? Let them put on the allowance. While this mess will last, we'll starve to death. Let's eat our ears first. We'll wash up and do our laundry." "What a lake!" Ushakov pointed to the smooth water visible behind the forest. His proposal was tempting. The detachment began to go to the lake. At that time, Dremin, who had discreetly left, appeared. "What, Sergeant, do we have to part? I found my company." "If you want, join us," offered. "No, we will look for our regiment," I replied. Dremin, having said goodbye to us, together with soldiers from his company, left us. There were 3 of us left, me, Ushakov and Elkin. We headed for the lake. Ushakov, apparently already experienced in fishing in this way, stripped naked and suggested that I do the same with Elkin. He took a grenade and threw it into the lake. After the explosion, up to a dozen large fish swam to the surface upside down. "And now follow me," shouted Ushakov and dived into the water. We lit a fire, hung over it kettles with water, and began to clean the fish. At that time, from the side of the woods separating the station from the lake, we heard a deafening stomping. A minute later, the bushes slid apart. Out of them came a junior lieutenant with a pistol in his hand and several men with rifles. "Hands up. Don't move," commanded the junior lieutenant. He jumped between us and the guns. He threw our machine guns aside with his foot and ordered us to get dressed. I began to explain that we had just got out of the German rear and were hungry, but the junior lieutenant did not heed me. "Now get dressed and hurry up. There, in the commandant's office, we will sort everything out." He hurried. The commandant's office was located in a small room of the station. Behind a one-table desk sat a thin, tall captain. The junior lieutenant reported that the detainees had been delivered and went out the door. The captain looked at us sternly and began to ask who we were, where we had come from, and what we were doing at the lake. I told in detail about our odyssey, and when the captain heard that all this could confirm Sergeant Dremin, who found his company here, he somehow immediately brightened up. "No, so Dremin is alive." The captain perked up. He called that junior lieutenant who brought us to the commandant's office and ordered that we were dressed, well-fed and enrolled in the housekeeping platoon. "What about their weapons?" Asked the junior lieutenant and signalled to the open door to bring the captured weapons into the room. Seeing the German automatic rifles, the captain said to replace them with ours. I tried to persuade him that German automatic rifles were better than ours. The captain replied that there was nothing to reason about, and I realized that trying to prove would be useless. We have to fight with our own weapons. Besides, we have no ammunition for these automatic rifles. So the captain put an end to the conversation about weapons. When he met us, a petty officer with a Budanov moustache looked at each of us from head to toe. "You must have had a good walk," he shook his head. I'll put you on allowance and I'll give you new uniforms. Mikhailchenko always has everything. It was not without reason that the regiment commander himself persuaded me to stay on overtime. While they pick up what you need from my stock, you'll have time for lunch. Mikhailchenko ordered the cooks to feed us well, and he went somewhere else. After several days of lack of hot food, we were greedy and eager to eat the warm soup, which the cook gave us a whole cauldron. We ate and could not get enough. For the second meal, we were also given almost a full pot of buckwheat porridge. We felt that our stomachs were already full, but we still wanted to eat. The cook looked at us carefully, somehow fatherly, and said that he would not give us more. He explained that after a hunger strike it was not good to eat too much at once. In the evening the cook promised to feed us to the brim. Immediately after such a meal we started to fall asleep. But then Mikhailchenko and the captain's officer came up. They were laden with uniforms. We were surprised that everything that the petty officer brought was in size. Mikhailchenko looked at us and laughed kindly, praising himself. Mikhailchenko has a good eye. When you were brought to me, I already then realized who needed what size. During my service, I must have dressed several thousand fighters, he said, as if cooing petty officer. Having changed our rags for new uniforms, we immediately went to bed. In the evening we were roused by the cook. He, as promised, fed us to the brim. He said we were at his disposal for the time being. In the morning, talking to the soldiers, I learned that we were in the area of Idritsa, that in the morning of July 6 in the 22nd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Ershakov, the Germans broke through the defence, captured a bridgehead on the northern bank of the Western Dvina. The enemy's advanced units have deeply broken through the defence and threatened to encircle us. At our station, more and more units, worn out in battles, arrived. Some went further, others made a break here and, having rested, continued their withdrawal. From the stories of the soldiers we could conclude that the Germans were advancing in large mechanized columns. We were destined to stay in the platoon only one day. On the next day began the hasty formation of battalions from those fighters who were at the station. The 1st Battalion left for the east in the middle of the day. The 2nd, in which we fell, in the company of Lieutenant Shiryaev, was delayed at the station after the departure of the 1st Battalion for 3 hours. Reconnaissance, returning from the mission, reported that the paths to the east cut off. After a short meeting, the commanders decided to fight their way to their own through the German rear, moving first in a southwestern direction and then turn east. What explains this particular route is still unclear to me. Already at sunset the battalion column left the station. We moved along an abandoned country road hoped that we would not meet the enemy, who preferred good roads. Captain Kudyakov led the column. My department, as part of the 1st platoon, was in the column following the commanders. My mood was depressed. We had just managed to get out of the enemy's rear and got there again. No one knew what was ahead of us, but everyone realized that it would not be easy and many were destined to die. Together with the commanders and staffers went a heavy major, about 50 years old. He constantly lagged behind and looked at the fighters. I don't know why he liked me. "Oh, Red Sergeant, I'll ask you to carry my bag for a while." The fat man addressed me. I did not refuse and took the gas mask bag from him. It turned out to be extremely heavy, 12 kilograms. That's the last thing I need, I thought. I was curious to know what kind of heavy things the major had taken with him. He apparently read in my eyes what I thought, and as if justifying himself said that he was in a hurry to get ready, and at the halt he would throw away everything unnecessary. Catching a convenient moment, I groped the bag. I didn't understand what was there, except cartridges. The major was walking beside me, trying to keep me in sight at all times, and persuaded me to join him as his orderly. It promised easy service. Already during the first hour of the journey he bored me so much that I could hardly restrain myself not to send him away. The road brought us to the fields, behind which we could see a large village. Here the head patrol was waiting for us. Combat Kudyakov stopped the column, gave the command not to go to the open places. He began to observe. Motorcycles were running around the village, cars with German soldiers. Commanders consulted and decided to cross the road east of the village at dusk. Major did not lag behind me a step. I did not ask who he was, but from his words I understood that he was not from our unit. He was a staff officer and had great connections with the high command. Our rush across the road was noticed by the Germans. No sooner did we hide in the woods than they covered the battalion with mortar fire. The enemy firmly sat on our tail, pursued us for 5 kilometers. The battalion steeply turned to the east and went, or rather ran, trying not to lose sight of the highway. The Germans were moving along another road in parallel, firing at us from machine guns. We had to take a steep right into the forest. Having deepened on 3 kilometers, we came across a swamp. Captain Kabarov ordered to take the defense from the side of the road. But from the side of the swamp we heard shooting. We realized that we were squeezed from both sides. Our company began to entrench on the side of the swamp, from where the Germans were attacking more and more strongly. Here came a senior political officer, Captain Postnikov. He began to dig himself a cell where our department took the defense. Ushakov, who quickly managed with his trench, offered to help Postnikov, but he refused. We could already clearly hear the squelching of swamp mud under our boots, saw flashes from machine gun bursts. Bullets whistled over our heads or lay near us. Company Commander Shiriev ordered not to open fire without his command, and only when among the rare bushes we could see silhouettes of soldiers walking in a dense chain, the lieutenant commanded. Fire. This the Germans did not expect. They scattered on the spot, then ran back. Hence machine gun and machine gun fire from close range mowed down the enemy. The Germans did not dare to attack again, but began to lazily fire mortars at us. Their fire did not bring much harm to the battalion, because the Germans themselves did not know where and how we were located in the defense. But some accidental, as they say, bad minds made trouble. For example, senior political officer Postnikov was killed dead. A heavy mine exploded between the trenches of my friends and killed both Ushakov and Elkin at once. When I was told that Ushakov was dead, I did not believe it. I simply didn't imagine that death could take such a rich man. But when I saw his lifeless body, white as a cloth face and slightly open mouth, I cried and felt weak, subject to death. But I do not know when it will catch up with me. I felt all alone. We hastily enlarged Postnikov's trench and buried 3 dead comrades in it, without having time to pay them military honours. We were caught in a tight ring. Kudyakov, having consulted with the commanders, decided to make our way eastward to the highway. The plan was as follows. The first company will fight in the village and break through it. The enemy will think that this is the main blow of the battalion and will send there all the forces. The battalion, meanwhile, south of the road rushes out of the ring. The Germans, having stopped shelling the battalion, were sure that it would not go anywhere and at dawn it would be possible to defeat us. Therefore, the attack of Lieutenant Shireyev's company on the village was unexpected. Germans in panic jumped out of the houses. The glow of the burning huts well illuminated the village. The soldiers threw grenades at the accumulations of Germans and poured on them from machine guns, Shireyev, as if from a machine gun, with mischief sowed from the Ruknik on the Germans, and shout, "Claps, do not scatter." Behind the village he stopped the company and said, "Moan. Come on, guys, let's give the Kraut some more fire in farewell." The company lay low and hit with all kinds of weapons on the Germans who tried to pursue it. The enemy did not expect this audacity and rolled back. The art of battle is not only in the attack, but also in the ability to break away from the enemy in time. "Follow me, guys," Shireyev shouted, and we rushed into the forest, where the broken battalion was to be. Before dawn there was enough time to get away from the road. On the side of the village and to the east of it, we could hear mines bursting for another half an hour. The Germans were blindly shelling the place where, according to their assumption, the battalion should be. Tired, we settled down in a thick fir tree rare for these places. We all slept uneasily, as the Germans could discover us at any time. Somewhere not far away roosters were singing. I woke up. Wiping my eyes, I saw that it was getting light. 20 meters away from me stood Captain Kudyakov. He stretched, did gymnastic exercises, put on his uniform. He looked as if he had not survived an anxious night of fighting and throwing. Suddenly we heard ringing female voices. Not far from us, 4 girls were walking along the path. The captain approached them, and for a long time they talked about something. Then he gathered the commanders and took them aside. Among them was an obese major. He did not part with a heavy gas mask bag, which I dragged for more than 15 kilometers, without knowing what was in it. They consulted for a long time, arguing. Lieutenant Shiriev was especially heated. Captain Kudyakov waved his finger at me. Probably because I was awake and sitting up, while everyone was lying. Take this sergeant with you on reconnaissance, he said to the slouchy, unattractive junior lieutenant. The captain set the task to find out what forces the enemy has in the neighbouring village. If there are no Germans there, then find the chairman of the collective farm and ask him for a couple of lambs and some other provisions. We set off in the direction of the village. Junior Lieutenant Denisov grumbled to himself all the way. I can't understand why he needs this reconnaissance if he has disbanded the battalion. Oh, how disbanded? I asked in surprise. Denisov explained that the captain proposed to sneak to their own small groups and Lieutenant Shiriev was against it and did not want to disband the company. So they argued. The captain threatened to have Shiriev court-martialed. What tribunal is there behind German lines? Denisov kept grumbling. We were walking towards the village along a gully overgrown with thick bushes. It went uphill and ended at the very village. There was not even a kilometre between the forest and the village. It was impossible to see from the edge of the forest what was being done in the streets. Although the sun was already shining, we did not get a tooth on a tooth. We collected all the dew from the bushes in the gully and were soaked to the skin. We decided to approach the village from the southern side, where we thought we would have a better view. We lay down behind a small hillock overgrown with grass. My eyes were sleepy and I wanted to sleep badly. It was as if the village had died out. But something stopped us, prevented us from entering it. There was a well-travelled road nearby. Junior Lieutenant Denisov suggested me to crawl to the other side of the road and watch the village from the side of the vegetable gardens. Indeed, the only street was better viewed from there. I saw nothing suspicious, and my eyelids closed by themselves. How long I slept, a minute or more, I do not know. It was as if something jolted me, and I opened my eyes. I looked about 100 meters away from me, between the beds. Half bent, a German was running. I realized that he intended to get around me from the rear and take me alive. I hit him with a bullet. He stumbled and fell down. I looked in Denisov's direction. I saw a German crawling towards him from behind. He approached the junior lieutenant about 30 paces. I fired a line at him too. The German answered me in the same way and, standing up to his full height, rushed to Denisov. I killed him with the second shot. And from the side of the village about a dozen Germans were already running towards us. I shouted to Denisov to run to the beam. I gave a few bursts at the fleeing Germans. They lay down in the furrows. I ducked down, rushed into the bushes and turned towards the gully. There I caught up with Denisov. Both of us were breathing heavily. Fortunately, the Germans did not chase us. When we reached the place where Captain Kudyakov should be waiting for us and our commanders, we found no one. At first I thought that we were lost, but after looking around more carefully, I realized that this was the right place. Where I was sitting before Captain Kudyakov called me to him. There was a cigar that I had not finished and had hastily extinguished. We looked around trying to find a note or something else that would help us understand what had happened, where the commanders had gone, but we found nothing. Maybe we were sent on a reconnaissance mission to get away, I thought. Denisov thought the same thing. That way we might not bring lambs, but stay sheared, said Denisov and swore profanely. I never heard him swear again, though we had been in various situations. And how could I not swear? Kudyakov's behaviour left us with a bad feeling as if he had betrayed us. He thinks more of himself, said Denisov. and we stopped our examination of the terrain and walked eastward through the forest. The dear junior lieutenant confessed that he could not cope with sleep, and when the sun warmed his back, he dozed off. He was awakened by a line from a machine gun, which I gave to the German. He realized what had happened only in the fir tree when I told him how everything had unfolded. In our situation, sleeping at the wrong time is a dangerous thing, commented Denisov. We decided to go farther into the forest and sleep, but it was not possible. Having climbed out of the lowland, we came to the road. We turned to the right, went through the forest again and came out again, obviously on the same road, which made a steep turn to the right, cutting off our way to the east. At this time we heard the noise of engines. We lay down 100 meters from the road and watched from the bushes. First, a group of motorcyclists passed by. A couple of minutes later, a column of cars with soldiers in the back. "What a good position," I said, looking at Denisov. Don't joke. We're running out of ammunition. They should be saved for the last resort. The junior lieutenant understood me and warned me. At that time, 3 motorcyclists came out from behind the turn. I was seized by some excitement, and taking the first one in my sights, I pulled the trigger. The car spun twice on the spot, kicking up a cloud of dust. The car that followed climbed on top of the first one. The third motorcycle slowed down, and the machine gunner sitting in the cradle gave a line at us, then a second. We, ducking down, rushed into the woods. Seeing us, the German machine gunner did not randomly shoot after us, but we managed to fall into a ditch. Then we crawled in the grass to a safe place. The Germans did not pursue us. We ran through the bushes as dazed into the depths of the forest. I don't know how much we rerun, a kilometer or 2, but we suffocated and slowed down the pace, switching to a quick step. I noticed that the sleeve of Denisov's uniform was wet. I stopped and dressed his wound. The bullet had gone along the arm above the elbow, not deeply catching the flesh, but the wound was bleeding, and I had to apply a tourniquet. Having done this, we moved on. We rested in the afternoon when the heat began to subside. We chose a thicket where sunlight hardly penetrates and fell asleep without paying attention to pesky gadflies and mosquitoes. We woke up only the next morning. We felt broken and exhausted. How we wanted hot tea. I had some brew in my bag, but we decided to refuse the temptation. The smoke from the fire would give away our whereabouts. After yesterday, we were extremely cautious. Getting out to our own, several times we came upon the Germans. There were very favourable moments, but we did not dare to take risks. But, as they say, hunger is not a bad thing. All the food from our bags was shaken out to the crumbs. Despairing, we decided to go to the road which we were afraid to do before. We chose a suitable place. There, the road ran along the slope of a hill. On one side of the road, which was higher, the forest was very close. On the other side, there was a meadow. We lay down and watched. Here and there, German cars were passing by. "They are settling in as if they were at home," Denisov grumbled. I understood him, and I was thinking about the same thing, and about the food we were only dreaming about. But nothing had appeared on the road that would have enabled us to get food. We had given up hope of luck and were about to leave the place when a wagon appeared. A huge beater was driving it leisurely. The driver jerked the reins lazily, and in the wagon itself, the load of which was covered with a tarpaulin, sat a thin, long German. He had a machine gun in his lap, and he was playing on his harmonica some cheerful motif reminiscent of a march. We listened. There was no noise of cars. I took aim and fired. The horse reared, sat on its hind legs and fell. The rider fell dead off the wagon. The thin German rolled off the wagon with lightning speed and dived into the ditch. His machine gun fell on the other side of the road. I gave another short line in the direction where the German had disappeared. We waited for half a minute and rushed to the wagon. At that time, the German jumped out of the ditch and ran across the meadow, looping back and forth. The wagon prevented me from seeing him, and the German took advantage of this. I fired 3 rounds at him. The German fell down and jumped up. I wanted to fire another line, but Denisov stopped. "Oh, don't waste ammunition." In the wagon under the tarpaulin was bread baked in small bricks. We tasted it, stale, but it was already food. We quickly filled our bags. At that time our German was walking leisurely through the meadow towards the forest. When he saw that we were looking in his direction, the German expressively patted his arse, saying, "Here you are," and played on his harmonica the very tune we had interrupted. I lost the intention of firing another line at him. Denisov and I laughed. Instead of hatred for this quick-witted German, there was even some sympathy. I'd never seen such a German during the whole war. On the third day, we went to the lake and met a small group of Red Army soldiers. There were 5 of them. They had probably just come out of the swamp and were drying their uniforms in the sun. At first we did not dare to approach them and watched from the bushes, and only when we were sure that they were ours, we approached them and said hello. They looked at us suspiciously and then invited us to sit for company. It seemed that our arrival interrupted some important conversation. After asking us who we were and where we were going, they calmed down. So I think the war will be over by the fall. The German's coming, you see. There's no holding him back. In a month and a half he'll be in Moscow. Instead of wandering around and being taken prisoner, it would be better to go to a village where there is no German and ask for a home with some widow or soldier. The women are hungry for men, they will accept them, and they need labourers in their farms too. And when the war is over, we'll see if we'll settle down or stay. And if not, we'll go home. Who will do as he pleases, the big man reasoned. What, do you want to be a deserter? I couldn't stand it. But Junior Lieutenant Denisov tugged my sleeve. Don't get too excited. The Germans are not far away. If you make noise, you'll ruin yourself and spoil the case. The lanky one glared at me. Indeed, the sound of a harmonica and voices came from afar. Denisov shoved me with his foot, saying, "Don't mess with me." Longshanks threw his rifle into the lake. Deserters, I muttered through my teeth with contempt. 2 of the 5 stood up too, hesitating, apparently wanting to come with us. But the long one gave them a look that made them sit down in the clearing again. We set off on our way to get away from the place where the sound of the harmonica was coming from. We wandered both in Belarus and in our Russian land. The landmark was the noise of battle. We came close to the front line, but there were no convenient moments to break through to our own. And Denisov's wound, which at first we thought to be trifling, made itself known more and more. We began to lose hope of getting out of the German rear, but, as luck would have it, we came to the hut of a forester, who helped us to get out to our own. We got to the station, where many fighters who came out of the encirclement had converged. There was a field hospital there which was preparing for evacuation. The hospital examined Denisov's wound and said that they would not let him go. The case was so serious that they might have to amputate his arm. I was present because the military doctor, a major of the medical service, was examining Denisov's wound on the porch of a long wooden building, probably a former school, filled to overflowing with beds. Denisov's eyes became moist after the military doctor's conclusion. I said goodbye to a good man with whom I had shared many troubles in the rear of the enemy and was on the verge of death. I shook his hand and wished him recovery. No matter how strong I was, but a few steps away from the porch, I felt that I could not hold back my tears. Not even a month and a half after the beginning of the war, and I had already met and lost so many good friends. Having parted with Denisov at the hospital, I went to the station commandant. There they registered me, asked me what unit I was from, why I was not with it, and told me that tomorrow a battalion would be formed. I had to listen to Captain Dementiev's command. Here I was issued a food certificate, according to which I received a dry ration for 3 days in the warehouse. In the square of the station, the fighters were in groups. They are the same as me, who came out of the encirclement. The only difference is that many came out in platoons and companies, and I OA2 with Denisov. But I had to part with him too, after wandering around the square and asking the Red Army about the regiment's whereabouts. I lost hope of finding my unit. My mood was not good, and I decided to visit Denisov once more. He was lying in the hospital near an open window, and it was not difficult to find him. Denisov was sitting on his bunk in his new underwear. He had shaved off the stubble he had grown in his wanderings in the rear. He looked more cheerful. The surgeon, who later examined him, said that the arm will not be amputated and promised to return Denisov to the ranks no later than a month. I was happy for my friend. He had time to ask everything in detail and informed me that we were at Veliki Luki station. The doctor's arrival in the ward interrupted our rendezvous. I headed for the public garden again. Despite the incessant German air raids, people felt calm. Anti-aircraft guns and patrolling fighters drove away the German bombers, who had to drop bombs on nearby settlements, villages, or wherever they could. Most of the fighters slept with their duffel bags and weapons under their heads. This precaution was not superfluous, as many came out of the rear without weapons and did not hesitate to steal them from others. I sat down under a huge poplar tree and untied my duffel bag. The dry rations I received here were different from the other dry rations I had received before. A handful of breadcrumbs, a piece of pork lard weighing no more than 200 grams, 10 pieces of sword sugar, and that was all. I was just getting ready to start my meagre lunch when I heard the command, "Come out and form up." Then the command was repeated by dozens of voices. I put a piece of sugar in my mouth, tied my sack, and went into formation. Captain Demantiev was thin, tall, slightly stooped, in an old, faded uniform, torn near the shoulder, but neatly sewn. He went around the formation and stood in front of it, where about 24 medium-sized commanders stood. Having talked about something with the commanders, Demantiev announced that the formation would now be divided into companies and platoons. The right flank was separated by a tall senior lieutenant. Again, the right flank on this row to the right. Cutting off part of the formation with his hand, the senior lieutenant commanded. Having withdrawn the soldiers by 20 meters, he announced that this was the first company, and he was its commander, Senior Lieutenant Koridze. Another commander, Lieutenant Bogdanov, did the same. I found myself in the second company. The captain announced that the lists of units would be made upon arrival at the site. He gave the command to divide the units into wagons. On the tracks behind the station stood a train of about 36 boxcars and open platforms. Our company had to be located on the open platforms. I settled down at the side of the platform. I was surrounded by unfamiliar guys. Next to me was a Red Army soldier of great stature. He turned out to be talkative and companionable. He looked at my buttonholes and asked, "Who you are, sergeant or junior sergeant?" "Miss Sergeant," I answered. "What have you got?" "On one buttonhole is sergeant and on the other, junior sergeant." He dug in his pocket, took out a stub of a chemical pencil and drew the missing triangle on the buttonhole. It had come off somewhere. "That's how it will be normal," he said. And then he introduced himself as Selivanov, a private. I paid attention to his hands. Huge fingers twice as big and thick as mine. In short, not a palm but a shovel. Selivanov asked me who I was, where I was from, what unit I was from. I briefly told him about my wanderings in the rear. He said that he also had to wander through the rear of the Germans, but he came out of there with his company and with few losses. "You should be glad you're in our company. We've got a good commander. I've seen him in battle and I've been behind the lines with him. Don't think he doesn't talk much. He's a human soul, he sees right through you and is fair. I will follow him in fire and water." Matrist Bogdanov Selivanov. Talking about this and that, we dozed off. We were awakened by someone shouting. "Pino Station." The train slowed down, stopped near the station. "Come out to form up. In a column, 3 by 3, stand up." Captain Demantiev commanded. A stocky and very firmly bunched captain approached him from the station. Demantiev introduced him to the battalion as a senior political officer. Here a lunch was prepared for the battalion. It consisted of soup and porridge. For the soldiers, most of whom had not eaten hot food for a long time, lunch was a feast. After lunch, we only managed to smoke a cigar each. Returning from the station master, Captain Demantiev gave the command. From Pino Station, the echelon left at dawn. It went quickly, making only short stops to miss oncoming trains. The wind was driving back smoke and barbed slag from the steam locomotive's chimney. We, who were on the open platforms, had to wipe our eyes now and then. In an hour we arrived in Ostashkovo. From the station the column moved to the wharf of Lake Selija. The same one about which we were told in school that it is the most beautiful lake on the Russian land. We arrived at the pier when the sun was at its zenith. The lake was clear, the water was transparent. The wind slightly rippled its surface. But I did not see anything special that could delight me. Here, at the wharf, there was to be a long break. Those who rode on the platforms were the first to rush to the water to wash off the soot that stung their faces and necks. Waiting for transportation, they stood there until evening. Nobody went farther from the wharf. There was a vast garden next to the wharves. The wharf itself looked neglected and orphaned. The wharves were empty, and there were no attendants in sight. The lake surface also looked desert. No steamer, no boat, not even a boat. "No, guys," shouted a fighter, pointing in the direction from where the small steamboat appeared. "This small boat won't carry half the battalion. She can only deliver lunch to the fishes," the Red Army men reasoned, looking at the old steamer, which was smoking mercilessly and approaching the wharf very slowly. Finally the boat docked. Hosseins came out to form up. Captain Dementiev gave the command. He walked along the line, came to the middle, and announced that in half an hour the loading would begin. Everyone must obey the orders of the captain and his command. Tomorrow in the afternoon the battalion should arrive in Demyansk. "There," said the captain, "we will receive dry rations for the whole way to the front line." The captain and his crew carefully inspected the steamer before boarding. On their faces did not feel anxiety and uncertainty, although the deck in several places sagged, and the impression was that with a small load the ship will fall apart. But the confidence of the sailors calmed the fighters, who at first were very suspicious of this succor. The landing was led by Dementiev himself. The captain of the ship, an old man with a long grey moustache and a worn tunic, showed something to Dementiev, smoking a pipe. To the surprise of all, the battalion was accommodated on the steamer. The overload was 3 times the norm. "Hey, how shall we sail?" "The soldiers are pulling water out of the portholes with their hands." His assistant shared his anxiety with the captain. "God willing, we will swim. As long as the German pilots don't find us." "Yes. If by the way," the old riverman answered. I, standing next to them, remembered the Velija crossing and imagined what would have happened to our boat if a bomb had exploded nearby. And at the same time I caught myself that, knowing about the danger, I felt much calmer than in the rear of the Germans. Yes, it is not enviable for those who are surrounded. If at the front the enemy threatens you from one side and you are with your own, it's still nothing, even when you have to retreat. And there, but even in those conditions we did our soldiers' job exterminating the occupants. This business is doubly dangerous, requiring great tension of nerves, strength, will and incredible patience. On deck I felt good at first. I looked at the shores of the lake. The steamer was not far from the shore, so that in case of appearance of German aviation to approach it, it made sense. If the bombing begins, then some of the people who can swim could stay alive. The shores we sailed past were low, almost level with the water's edge, and covered with forest. To my tired eyes the forest turned into the shore, and then it seemed as if we were floating in a thicket with high edges. As it began to get dark, I felt tired and was unable to fight sleep. I unfolded my rope, put my bag and my automatic rifle under my head and fell asleep unnoticeably, as if I had fallen somewhere, having lost my memory and consciousness. I woke up from the morning chill. The sky in the east had already turned grey. From behind I could hear the measured splashing of water from the wheels of the steamboat. The water seemed black, only the foam was white behind. Apart from the splashes and puffing of the steamer, nothing was heard. The steamer itself seemed to stand still. Wiping my eyes, I rolled up my overcoat, put on my overcoat and shoulder bag, and cautiously crept between the sleeping soldiers to the rail. The sun had already risen above the horizon. The surface of the lake shimmered with pink light, played with it. Seliger, I thought. How colourfully described it in school geography teacher. And what silence. After constant weariness and dangers, to be in such silence is the best rest. I envied the crew that was driving this steamer, and I heard footsteps behind me. The captain approached me. The old man touched me on the shoulder and told me to be careful near the rail. He told me that last week a fighter fell into the water and was rescued. And then, either out of boredom or to keep me awake, the old man started talking. He didn't care who he talked to, as long as he talked. He said that on the previous voyage German fighters had fired on his ship. It would have been lost if it had been attacked by stormtroopers and bombers. I learned from the captain that more than one division had been transported on his wretched vessel since the beginning of the war. At that time the steamer jerked sharply, as if it had caught on something, and then it shook. The deck shook. Something rattled. Those who were in the saloon murmured and jumped up from their seats. The ship jerked again and swayed to the right, losing speed. Don't panic. Nothing serious has happened. His nonchalant look and voice calmed the people. A few minutes later, the ship was still moving forward normally. The further they sailed, the thicker the fog became. The last kilometers, the captain led the steamer almost in total lack of visibility. Late in the morning, we docked at some old wharf. It turned out that it was not Demyansk. The captain on the radio received a command to disembark the battalion without reaching the final point, as there is very active German aviation. We landed on an old wharf. The captain said that this is the northernmost point of the lake. From it to Demyansk is farther than from the point we planned to reach at the beginning. Captain Dementiev led the battalion in a northwest direction. He did not have a map, and the column often deviated from the given route. The road was clarified in settlements. Or had to go through forests and swamps, as the German aviation controlled the roads. The battalion stopped for 3 days on the bank of a tributary of the Polar River, near the railroad station. Here the battalion was replenished with 200 Red Army men. After that, the unit had 3 full companies, a reserve platoon and the necessary special services. We received ammunition and weapons. Here for the first time I saw rifles with unpainted Prorufen buttstocks. Apparently there was not enough time to finish these products. After the war I asked many frontline soldiers if they had seen such rifles. No one had ever come across one. Apparently such batches of weapons were very rare. Here, near the station, it was planned to hold exercises on forcing water obstacles, because before the front we had to overcome the Polomity River and swamps. But on the next day, the company commander, Lieutenant Bogdanov, announced that the exercises on forcing rivers were cancelled because in that section of the front where we were sent, the tanks were operating. The company created several groups of tank fighters. These groups were composed of physically strong fighters. My first acquaintance from the company Selivanov got into such a group. In the regimental school, we were told that a tank can be stopped if you throw a bunch of grenades under the tracks. You can destroy a light tank if the bundle hits the engine compartment. But we were not told anything about special groups to repel tank attacks, considering the fight with tanks a matter of artillery. On the 3rd day, early in the morning, the battalion was raised on the alert. A German air scout, Rama, was circling over the station. The battalion quickly dismounted. The column forced march in the forest in the given direction to the front. We already knew that in about a quarter of an hour over the place where the battalion was located will appear bombers or attack aircraft. After a couple of hours we came to the road where under cover of trees and bushes stood a column of cars. We were driven by cars to the front for 30 kilometers. Then we moved on foot in a marching column. In the afternoon of August 19, the battalion came to one of the villages on the river Lovov, and then again went through forests and swamps, forcing 2 rivers. The soldiers were extremely exhausted. As long as we get to the front, we'll stretch our legs, complained many. But ahead we could hear explosions and shots more and more clearly. The front is somewhere near. The battalion stopped for a rest. The soldiers fell on the wet ground grass Some took off their boots. The commanders of the units gathered at the commander's office to familiarize themselves with the situation and to receive the combat task. They had to rest for a short time. Bogdanov came with platoon and built the company. He set the task. It was to occupy one of the largest heights of the hill, which is 3 kilometers away, and fortify there. On our right would be the first company of Senior Lieutenant Koridis, and on our left would be the company of Lieutenant Sobolev, a very young commander who had taken over this unit after the battalion landed on Lake Selija. Our battalion would be in the second line of defense, and if necessary, some of its units could be used as a reserve for the first line of defense. The positions were to be reached by a rush. When we took the defense, Lieutenant Bogdanov gave the command to urgently entrench. The high ground we were on was an elongated hump about half a kilometer long. It was not easy to defend it, as the enemy had tanks. Lieutenant Bogdanov said that the first line of defense would be held by the battalion, which had a third of its personnel left, and that we would be supported by 2 platoons of Magpies and a platoon of company mortars. From the heights on which we fortified ourselves, the first line of defense was clearly visible. It ran along the same ridge of hills, which extended well below our heights. In front of them, on the enemy's side, lay an open area, not like fields, not like men. We had therefore an opportunity of observing the action of the enemy and our own in the first line of defense. When we went to the position, there was a battle going on, and apparently therefore the enemy did not notice how the second line of defense was formed. The battalion held firmly to the heights, more favourable position than the enemy helped to defend them. But the forces were clearly unequal. The defending battalion was supported by only 2 45mm guns. The enemy continuously poured mines and shells on the battalion. Ours responded with rifle and machine gun fire only when the Germans were in the kill zone. The commanders said that the entire western slope of the heights was strewn with German corpses. We could not see it from our trenches, but from the fact that the battalion repulsed dozens of attacks, you can imagine what it cost the enemy. We hastily entrenched ourselves and at the same time watched the progress of the battle. The German artillery transferred the fire to the saddles between the heights. Why this was done, we guessed afterwards, to clear the way for encirclement of those who fought on the heights. Soon after such shelling, a group of German machine gunners through the saddle rounded the hill opposite us and began to crawl from the rear to the defenders. Selivanov wanted to hit them with a hand machine gun, but I stopped him, not a shot without a command from the company commander. But everyone's nerves were on edge. Everyone could hardly restrain himself not to pull the trigger. At that time 36 soldiers jumped out from somewhere on the right and rushed to the heights. In front ran the commander of the reserve platoon, Sergeant Ainov, who could not fail to be recognized by his huge height. Because of the noise of the battle, the Germans did not notice the approach of the platoon. Besides, they knew that the battalion had exhausted its reserves and there was nowhere to wait for help. The reserve platoon, almost at point-blank range, shot the Germans who had broken through, and having lost only 3 wounded, returned back. This, as we learned later, was done on the orders of Captain Dementiev, who kept the reserve platoon with him. The defenders of the high-rise only afterwards learned that they were on a hair's breadth from death. The enemy before our eyes 3 times attacked the first line of defence and rolled back. After the 3rd unsuccessful attack, the battalion began to withdraw. First the wounded were carried out, then the rest went. It was unbelievable that a battalion was holding the defence here. Not more than 100 people left the position alive, for the withdrawal of the defenders used the respite after another attack. The Germans thought that the defenders had left, but, having come to their senses, they rushed to finish ours. It was too late. Enemy infantry, without the support of tanks and artillery, not knowing that created a second line of defence of fresh forces, ran into such a fire that swarmed in the open and rushed back, leaving dozens of dead and wounded. Yes, we'll have a hard time here, Selivanov said thoughtfully, sipping a cigarette. I agreed with him, but did not answer. At night the enemy did not dare to attack us. We used this time to open the cells in full height, connect them with the passages and better camouflage. The task of our section was to cover the saddle between our and the neighbouring heights with fire. Bogdanov, who had time to go around all the firing points and trenches, defined for us the landmarks of future fire, told us to prepare bundles of grenades, as everyone understood that the enemy would certainly use tanks to sweep us off this ridge. An hour after dawn began the processing of our positions by aviation. The bombs were falling so thickly that the heights were moving from the bursts, and clay was falling off in the trenches. It seemed that after such treatment there would be nothing left alive, but the company did not get much damage from the bombing. It was good that they were able to entrench in time and properly. Then began mortar and artillery fire. It was felt that the enemy was hitting at random. He still did not know our positions well and probed them with fire. But from our side he did not receive any response. At this time the enemy infantry was accumulating in the shrubbery, which was located at the eastern foot of the ridge of heights, abandoned the day before by our troops. When the shelling ceased, the artillerymen of the 40-50 rolled out their guns to direct fire. Their position was 50 meters to our right. Several rockets flew into the air from the enemy's side. We tensely watched the shrubbery where the infantry was concentrated, knowing that the strongest blow would come from there. A minute and another passed, but no one came out of the shrubbery. Suddenly 5 light tanks and 2 armoured personnel carriers jumped out of the saddle. They turned in a chain, and then the infantry came out of the shrubbery. Under the cover of armour it began to approach our positions. Our mortars and magpies hit them with a thin fire. But this fire did not affect the enemy. Chains went quietly. Only 1 tank stopped and slightly rumbled. But the tankers apparently put out the fire themselves. The machine remained standing in place, but its gun was firing. The armoured personnel carrier, from which the infantry spilled out, also burst into flames. But everything else continued to move on us. The tankers had apparently spotted our gunners, and shells from the tanks were mostly raining down around them. One of the guns was soon shattered, and the calculation was completely killed. The second 40-50 stopped firing as the tanks and transporter entered the dead zone for the gun. We waited breathlessly for the Germans to come within range of small arms fire. Fire cut off the infantry from the tanks. Bogdanov commanded, and a barrage of bullets splashed on the advancing chains. The Germans stopped, scattered, but the officers quickly put in order, and the chains of infantry again hastily moved forward, away from the tanks. Selivanov and Surkov, the new soldier of the squad, who arrived with the last replenishment. Excitedly, long bursts hit the Germans. I slowed down, waiting for the Germans to come closer. But now it was my turn. "You're asleep? There's a tank coming at you. Where are the armoured fighters?" Someone tapped me hard on the shoulder. I turned around. Behind me was Lieutenant Bogdanov. His eyes are running, burning with anger. I run up to Selivanov and Surkov. I order to move forward and destroy the tank with bundles of grenades. Taking 2 bundles each, the guys jumped out of the trench. After running about 20 meters, one of them hid in a specially dug cell, the other jumped into the funnel, but the funnel was shallow and could not completely hide Surkov. Fortunately, the tankers were engrossed in other targets and did not notice the guys. 1 grenade thrown by Surkov got under the track. The machine turned on the spot and stalled. But the turret turned to where the tank was heading. Around Surkov's trench jumped a spray of bullets, sent by the German infantrymen who we had pinned to the ground with our fire. Is Surkov really dead? Flashed through my mind. But he rose from the funnel and threw a grenade into the second trek. Why was Selivanov inactive? But here sounded one after another 2 explosions. It turns out that I watched Selivanov jumped out of his cell, crawled up to the side of the tank and threw 2 grenades into the shutters of the tank. The machine burst into flames. Tankers began to jump out of the hatches and were immediately cut down by machine gun and machine gun fire. The weather was overcast, and the smoke from the burning tank pressed against the ground. It was like a smoke screen that hid the Germans on our right. I put in a new disc and looked at the smoke, expecting the Germans to jump out of there, taking advantage of this veil. But from this side I saw Selivanov. He was crawling, dragging the wounded Surkov behind him. The guy's wound was heavy. A machine gun bullet had penetrated his left shoulder. The other two slipped through. One tore off the skin on his neck. The other slightly caught his right arm. Selivanov laid his comrade at the bottom of the trench and bandaged him as best he could. When I saw that a group of Germans was approaching the saddle, I shouted to Selivanov, to the machine gun. Wait, I'll take a breath. He snapped at me, but he ran up to his gun and gave the fascists a long line, making them flee. The attack was repulsed. On the battlefield there were many corpses of the enemy, 3 burned tanks and an armoured personnel carrier. One of the tanks was burned already in our rear. He jumped through the saddle, and only then the fighters pelted him with bundles of grenades. But our losses were impressive. We lost our anti-tank artillery. In the company broke 2 handheld and 1 machine gun. A third of the personnel killed and wounded. The enemy, despite the losses, again prepared to attack the heights. His infantry was concentrated in the bushes, and from the saddle there went new units. If we could sweep this bush with good artillery and heavy mortars, it would be easier for us, Kuzikov said thoughtfully. Abi Dakabi, then in the mouth would grow mushrooms. Said Selivanov. At that time, Senior Lieutenant Ryabinin approached us in the course of the message. He argued with Bogdanov, who thickly sprinkled his speech with mate. Where will I find replenishment for you? I myself have half of the company left, almost shouted Bogdanov. You have half, and in the first and the platoon will not even have a platoon. It was the main blow of the Germans, and the commander was killed. I have to be the chief of staff and command the company. We just have to hold out here until morning, and then we'll withdraw to those heights. Showed Ryabinin on a ridge of small hills behind our defence. Where? To those heights? And leave these ones. From here those hills can be seen from the palm of your hand. The German will immediately throw us out of there. Bogdanov got hot. We have only a day to hold out there. There are large forces coming. Did not concede Ryabinin. We leaned against the wall of the trench to let the commanders through. At that time the enemy fired a whole series of rockets upwards. It's starting. I'll go to the first one, but don't forget to send at least half of the platoon to help us. Ryabinin hastily turned back and shouted. As before the previous attacks, this one was preceded by artillery treatment of our positions. The Germans, having received reinforcements, attacked us more fiercely, and we answered them with weak fire. The tanks, having escorted the infantry to the very foot of the heights, turned back, thinking they had done their job. The infantry approached our trenches for 50 metres and rushed into the attack. But though the fire from our side was not dense, it forced the Germans to slow down, and when grenades flew, they had to lie down. The tank fighters, who were in the cells forward and were closer to the Germans, threw several bundles of grenades in the direction of the enemy. Their explosions looked impressive, and the Germans began to crawl back. I don't know from where a machine gun appeared on the right flank. His lines forced the Germans to finally roll back. After repelling this attack, Lieutenant Donov passed the command to gather behind the heights. Having picked up the wounded, we began to withdraw. Suddenly Captain Dementiev appeared from somewhere. "Lieutenant, what is it?" shouted Combat. "We're getting away before it's too late," answered Bogdanov. "We'll get back. Tomorrow I'll court-martial you," Dementiev threatened with his pistol. Captain's quarrel with the lieutenant was interrupted by a messenger from the regimental headquarters. "Comrade Captain, it's very urgent for you." Your junior sergeant waved a package. Dementiev immediately tore the package, read it and spoke in a different tone. "Take the company to those heights. Order of the regimental commander. Neighbouring battalions are already withdrawing." He tore the order into small shreds and scattered the scraps in the wind. On the small hills we didn't last long. Having repulsed 2 attacks, we left our positions and crossed the highway. Captain Dementiev led us through forests and swamps. Nobody knew where we were going. neither did we know how the events unfolded in the future on the section of the front we had left. We knew one thing. The road was of great importance for the front, and that is why our commanders and personnel defended their positions so stubbornly. Everything possible was done to stop the enemy's advance, but he outnumbered us here.